Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Understanding Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2021. Before I ask Nima to introduce the speaker to us, I'm just going to run through a couple of ground rules for this webinar. We request everyone to keep themselves the speaker and what they're trying to share. And we also would want everyone to switch off their camera for the moment so that we can highlight the speaker. And we also, if there are any questions, please ask them in the chat box, which will be taken after Ritvik is done with his presentation. So I hope everyone, if there are any doubts, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us who are the co-hosts. And I look forward to a very successful webinar. And one more thing, if there are people who are trying to enter this webinar, please also streaming it live on YouTube, and we would people can go and watch it on YouTube live. And you can tell your friends who are trying to join in this thing that they can join the YouTube live. So over to you, Nima.
Thank you, Shruti, and namaste and welcome to everyone once again. Thank you for joining us today. You all know that amongst the various other acts, the Wildlife Protection Act has also come up for amendments, and a joint parliamentary committee has been formed, which is expecting responses from public, and the last day of the responses from the public is for the 11th of February, which is just a couple of days away from now. So it is in this context that we are organizing this meeting today to try and understand some of the main provisions that have come up for amendment and what would be the implications of these amendments on the conservation of wildlife, the protected areas, the people who live in and around those protected areas, and any other concerns related to the provisions. And we are very fortunate that once again we have Ritvik with us to talk about these amendments. Most of you know him very well. Ritvik is a founder and managing trustee of Legal Initiative for Forest and Environment, Life, an organization based in Delhi. He graduated in sociology and law from the University of Delhi, and he has been involved in numerous environmental litigation in over 15 years in both the Supreme Court of India as well as the National Green Tribunal. In addition to a very good legal understanding of the law, Ritvik also has a deep practical understanding of the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act because of engaging with these provisions in the various cases that he's been involved with. I wouldn't take too much time right now, so welcome and thank you very much for accepting this. Ritvik, over to you.
Thank you, Nima. And thank you, Shruti, for organizing this and inviting me. So, given the time, and this is the second part after having dealt with the Biodiversity Act, I intend to cover the key concerns with regard to the Wildlife Protection Act. And as many of you would know that it's now before the Parliamentary Standing Committee or Departmental Related Standing Committee. There's an essential difference. The Biodiversity Act is before the Joint Parliamentary Committee, and this is before the Standing Committee, which is the Departmental Related Standing Committee. Now, what I will be covering is some of the key issues, concerns, and maybe also deal with some of the positive aspects of the amendment. If one compares between the Biodiversity Act and Amendment Bill and the Wildlife Protection Act Amendment Bill, one finds that there is one critical difference. And that's it, essentially that when one looks at the Biodiversity Amendment Bill 2021, one is unable to find a single positive aspect which is in favor of biodiversity or communities or conservation or sustainable use or fair and equitable sharing of benefits. In fact, the way the amendment has been done so far as Biodiversity Act is concerned, it completely violates India's commitment to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. Unlike this, the changes that have been proposed, so far as the Wildlife Act is concerned, there are certain positive aspects which I will deal with. So it is not as negative a development in comparison to the Biodiversity Act Amendment Bill. Nonetheless, there are issues which still needs a proper discussion, and the aim now is basically to share some of my concerns and views with the larger audience. So first and foremost, I'll just put it here. Yes. Is, when we are going before or making submission to the department-related parliamentary standing committee, there is one major limitation that one has to take into consideration is obviously what is the power and scope of a department-related parliamentary standing committee. As we know, it has members from both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. And if you look at it here in terms of it is that the chairperson of Rajya Sabha nominates 10 and the chairperson of Lok Sabha nominates 21. That's how the parliamentary standing committee comes in, the department related, and it is attached to a particular department. So this is not a joint body of both the houses. Yes, it represents members of both the houses, but they're connected to the department that is there. In this case, it's the Department of Science, Technology, Environment, Forest, and Climate Change. Now, if we look at the powers and the functions, why it's important to understand is essentially that because we must know, that when we are making a submission, what is the scope before the standing committee to make an impact on the legislation that is coming in. Now, if you look at it here, it says 270. This is part of what I can go is called rules of procedure and conduct of business in the Council of States. And the rules, and it says that to consider demand of grants of the related ministries and department to examine bills. Now, to examine bills pertaining to related departments referred to the committee by the speaker and report thereon. So this is what it is. It is basically a bill that has been referred to the standing committee. And it also says that something very important, provided the standing committee shall not consider day-to-day administrations and matters relating to those issues, because that is the domain of the executive and not of the legislature. Now, if you look at it here, this is what we are concerned about, is examine bills pertaining to related ministries and departments. Now, the committee shall examine only such bill introduced in either as it is referred to by the speaker or the chairman. Now, what is important here is that the committee shall consider the general principles and clauses of such bills. Now, I want to emphasize here, because without undermining effort, without saying that it should not have been done, I've seen many reports of groups, organizations where detailed reports have been or submissions have been made to the standing committee about what the law should be. Now, unfortunately, the standing committee's mandate is only limited to the clauses of such bills. So what should be an ideal law? Whether new commission should come in, new provision should be there. How do we manage national park and sanctuary differently? These are important issues. But that is not what the standing committee is to consider. Standing committee is to limit itself only to clauses of such bills. And therefore, if you have a problem with 5 other clauses of the bills, so long as it is not in contradiction or in opposition to a clause that is now been amended or introduced, the standing committee is not to consider that. So while making our submissions, it's very important for us to know the limitation of the power of the standing committee itself. So basically, even in my presentation, I'm not going to say what an ideal wildlife law should be. Here, I'm basically limiting myself to the specific clauses, and because of paucity of time and my own limitation on understanding each and every section with regard to every clause that has been introduced, I'll limit my presentation to few of the clauses which are of concern. Now, also very important is to understand what will happen. You know, we make a submission to the standing committee, what will happen? It says, well, the report of the standing committee shall have persuasive value and shall be treated as a considered opinion or an advice. So therefore, at the least, it is only an advice. So ultimately, it is the government, the executive, and then which goes before the parliament, which is really the master of this law. So the parliamentary standing committee or departmental related standing committee has a persuasive value, and it's essentially an advice. The government is free to accept it or to reject it. They may give reasons, they may not, but ultimately it is the government's prerogative, so long as they convince parliament that such changes needs to be made. So keeping that in mind, what is the bill and what are the issues on which the departmental related standing committee, which has asked for an opinion? Because in a democracy, though it is true that it's an advice, but persuasive value also has a value. And I think that's very important to understand. So I'm nowhere suggesting that we don't take the process seriously because it is only at the end of the day, only an advice. So, you know, coming to it, what are the positive aspects of the law itself? Well, first and foremost is the fact that, you know, it has introduced this term of alien invasive species. So, so this is important because the existing law does not recognize vermin, which is a problematic term, but alien invasive species is a big problem. We see it with regard to many species. So therefore, introducing a definition of alien invasive species and a regulation is a positive aspect that is there. CITES chapter, the chapter on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, is again something that has always been there in the queue, because ultimately most of CITES was getting implemented through the EXIM policy, the export-import policy. We did not have a domestic legislation which is actually looking at making CITES enforceable through a domestic law. So I think without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, because again, I think discussion on CITES needs a different presentation, a different focus, and different set of questions, and maybe different experience. So today I will only limit my CITES by stating that, you know, CITES is a new chapter. It has been introduced. It's a positive step, no doubt about it. But I'll not cover the CITES management authorities about import and export, because that will require a much longer discussion. For the first time, they've introduced or give legal recognition to management plan for sanctuaries. So till today, management plan was an executive act. It did not have a legal backing. So today, the fact that this law today recognizes that every sanctuary must have a management plan is again a positive aspect, because unlike also similar to working plan, every forest must be managed in accordance with an approved management working plan. But unfortunately, the Indian Forest Act or most of the state Forest Act do not refer to a working plan. Supreme Court in Godavarman says no felling of trees unless there is an approved working plan. So it got us not a statutory backing, but legal backing by virtue of the Supreme Court order. But management plan also were mentioned in few of the judgments of the Supreme Court, but was not incorporated in the statute. So today we find that this management plan been mentioned in the law. There's been an expansion in the list of plants, not in great list, but nonetheless little bit expansion from the list that was earlier there. And very importantly, now there's a huge issue with it, is the rationalization of the schedules to the Wildlife Protection Act. So we don't have the same number of schedules as earlier, but again, There's been huge concern about many missing species, of species which should have been higher in the level of protection, which are getting lower the level of protection. Again, these are things which, I'm happy to know that many organizations have given good suggestion about what has been missed out in the listing of species concern. Now, what are the key concerns that are there? At one level, invasive alien species is a positive aspect, but the definition that is proposed is problematic. It does not address the problem. Second, I would like to cover a little bit on the issue with regard to vermin and how it is proposed to be dealt. Third is the issue with regard to State Board for Wildlife. Then section 29, which looks very positive, allowing water from national park and sanctuaries to be used for domestic and household purpose. Penalty provisions have been enhanced. I don't think so that will make great changes, because almost every theory says that it is really not the severity of the punishment, but the certainty of the punishment. And what we find today is that so far as the Wildlife Act is concerned, the penalty provisions are far, the standard approach is to increase the penalty. That's not the answer to it, but again, that will require a longer debate. And I think one of the many problematic parts is the opening up of trade in live elephants. This is an issue of serious concern. And I think this is something where collective effort needs to be put in by groups across to oppose the opening up of trade so far as captive elephants are concerned. So when we look at the first aspect, invasive alien species, the short form interestingly is IAS, means a species or animals or plant which is not native to India and whose introduction or spread may threaten or adversely impact wildlife on its habitat. Now, it's great, but when you look at it here, this is completely out of tune with the definition of what is invasive alien species. And if you look very clearly, it really doesn't mean much, because a spotted deer or a crow in Andaman is also an invasive alien species, even if Axis is an Indian species. It doesn't really matter. So if you're introducing, a species, whether, so long as it is Indian, these boundaries have been made by us. So how does it matter whether it is Indian or foreign, as long as it is an alien? So if a species which is, as I said to you just before, that if you look at it, there's an article here that comes, spotted deer and bullfrogs posing a threat to native species of Andamans. Now, this is a report by the National Biodiversity Authority, which found that, it doesn't matter. Spotted deer is no native to India, but you release them in Andamans, there is a serious problem. So therefore, there is a concern with regard to the fact that if you look at the international definition, that is the IUCN definition, CBD definition, an alien species is a species introduced outside its natural past or present distribution. And if this species become problematic, it is termed as an invasive alien species. So just because it's alien is not a problem unless it becomes invasive. But at the same level, I think what needs to be done is to relook into it. I know it's a controversial stand, but in the interest of wildlife, certain positive decisions need to be taken. And what I'm suggesting, and I know many other groups are also focusing on this, is actually to change the word to problematic species. So domestic dogs, which have become a threat to wild animals in a range of habitat, can be declared as a problematic one, despite the fact that they are technically not alien. That they can be invasive because they do breed. But if we are looking at protection of wildlife, merely firstly limiting to the existing definition will not work. We need to expand it to take in the international recognized definition of invasive species, which is something which is exotic to a particular ecosystem. That's the most important thing. And very importantly, we must expand it to include problematic species, even if they are domestic, even they are native to that particular area. If they cross the limit, a certain assessment needs to be done, but this is something that, I want to suggest. Next, what it does is here in 62A is that the central government may by notification now regulate the import, trade, possession and proliferation of invasive alien species. We know many species of turtles have now come in through the pet trade, which are becoming invasive. Till today, there was no power in the hands of the central government to regulate them because they are not included in the schedule of the Wildlife Protection Act. So I think this is important provision, but it needs to be expanded. So the other point that is there is, so far as rationalization is concerned, this is the first time they are saying, well, Schedule 1 species have the highest level of protection. Schedule 2 species have lesser level of protection. Schedule 3 specifies protected one. And then we have the international convention. But I just want to say, in reality, what it means is slightly different. It doesn't mean necessarily that a Schedule 2 gets no protection. We must be clear why we want a particular animal in Schedule 1 and not in Schedule 2. Now, for example, the first basic difference between Schedule 1 and 2 is, well, if hunting takes place with regard to an animal that is specified in Schedule 1, you get what is called minimum punishment. If it's an animal with lower punishment, lower protection, you get what is called maximum punishment. Now, it may look very strange why I'm suggesting this. The point is, when we look at penalty provisions in any law, what really matters is, does the law provide for minimum punishment or does it provide for maximum punishment? If the offense is serious, the law provides for minimum punishment. And if the offense is not so serious, the law provides for maximum punishment. Why it is so, again, let me explain. So if an offense takes place against a Schedule 1 species, then the person concerned shall be punished for a term of imprisonment which shall not be less than 3 years, but may extend to 7 years. And when it happens with regard to other schedules, it shall be punished with a term of imprisonment that may extend to 3 years or 5 years, which means that the person can be punished even with 1 day of imprisonment or with a fine. But if it's a serious one, the magistrate cannot give less than 3 years. That is why the unamended law, that is not this law, the earlier version of the law says, if you kill a Schedule 1 species, you will go to jail for at least 1 year. That is why the judge gave what they call as the minimum punishment to Salman Khan, which is 1 year imprisonment. So this is where the entire rationalization has taken place, where rather than Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 that we have, it is now reduced to only 4. Of which, what is very interesting is, and which I think needs a far greater discussion or longer discussion or in-depth discussion, is the problem with regard to vermin. Now, first and foremost, I think calling any species as a vermin itself is a wrong. It's wrong to call something that is created by nature as a pest or a vermin. So I think this is something that this law should have addressed by not calling them a vermin. But anyway, they've called it. The existing law says, well, vermin is those species which are listed in Schedule 5. Common crow, fruit bats, mice, and rat. The implication of a species becoming vermin is very dangerous. What it principally means is that you basically treat it like a domestic animal. You can do whatever you want. That is why mice and rats are caught in the most inhuman way, because we don't consider them as living beings at all. They are treated and killed in the most barbaric way. Now what has happened is the law says, well, these 4 species are vermin. Now the new amended law says now that the central government may by notification declare any wild animal specified. Sorry, I just missed out one, which is the change. Okay, I'll tell you this one because I think the slide is missing. Now the new law says that the central government may by notification declare any wild animal specified in any schedule other than Schedule 1 as a vermin. So what it means today is that it is not just mice, rat, crow. Any of the species which is listed in Schedule 2 or of the Act itself can be declared as a vermin. And that I think is very, very problematic, because it means even species like a fox, which is listed, or a striped hyena, which is listed there, can actually be declared as a vermin. I can give you the list so far as it is concerned. Now, this is also problematic because there is nothing in the law which requires them to carry out a scientific assessment. I can share my own experience when it came to the government of Himachal declaring monkeys as vermin in the municipal areas of Himachal Pradesh. They passed a notification saying monkeys declared as a vermin in the municipal areas of Himachal Pradesh in order to protect the farmers in the state of Himachal Pradesh. We challenged that before the High Court and said, this is absurd. You want to protect farmers in Himachal Pradesh against crop raiding by monkeys. Then why do you declare them as a pest only in the municipal areas of Simla? Is farming happening in that area? And then when we started probing into it, we found what was deeply problematic. The Chief Justice of Himachal, I was appearing in that matter, asked me, what is your problem? I said, I have no problem. The problem today is that monkey is been declared as a vermin. There is a study by the government of Himachal Pradesh Forest Department, which found that monkey has become a menace. And the reason why the monkeys are menace is three. First reason is because of the forest department is not planting enough number of fruit bearing trees in the forest area. As a result, there is nothing to eat in the forest. The second reason for the monkey menace is the poor garbage disposal system, as a result of which monkey find it more attractive to come and eat in garbage and from people who just litter it around. The third reason is the cultural aspect of it, where people who go to temple feed monkey. So the judge asked me, so where is the problem? All the three reasons are correct. I said, yes, but where is the monkey's fault? You are giving the monkey a capital punishment for three things which have been done by human being. So what we found today is that there has been no assessment done in order to look at, why we declare certain species as vermin, because once it gets declared as vermin, it loses its life completely. It can be killed, it can be traded, it can be sold, it can be done anything. Only law that applies is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Nothing else applies. So therefore, this power that has now been given to the central government to declare any species other than Schedule 1 as a vermin is problematic. The earlier law says it can declare a vermin only if it is excluding Schedule 1 and Part 2 of Schedule 2. So now the area for declaration is huge. There's a problem. The next part that I want to deal with is again a very, very important issue, is the power with regard to the State Board for Wildlife. Again, even with regard to people or conservationists who are members of the State Board for Wildlife, I always see them writing saying, I'm part of the State Advisory Board, Wildlife Advisory Board. Well, no, State Wildlife Advisory Board no longer exists. This is the State Board for Wildlife. I've also seen a lot of discussion saying, well, it's a recommendatory body. It's an advisory body. Again, it's a wrong idea. It is the State Board for Wildlife. And if you look at the State Board for Wildlife that exists today, the chairperson is the chief minister, the vice chairperson is the minister in charge of forest and environment. Then there are 3 persons to represent NGOs. And many a times, what is today happening is that the State Board is able to at least raise its voice against many of the destructive projects that are happening. One of the oft-repeated cases of the Hubli-Ankola, where the members of the board strongly opposed approval being granted to the Hubli-Ankola railway line in Karnataka. Now, what is now being proposed is interesting. Now, what has been proposed is that there will be a State Board for Wildlife, but there will now be a standing committee of the State Board for Wildlife. And the decisions can be taken by the standing committee of the National Board for State Board for Wildlife. This is replicating the exact model of the National Board for Wildlife, which has not met from 2014. The board has not constituted a standing committee, but the vice chairman, who is the Minister for Environment, chooses few people, Dr. Sukumar, Professor Sukumar, whatever, there, and H.S. Singh, and then decides they will now be the standing committee. Rest of the members are there only in name. They never meet. They are not consulted. Their advice is not taken in. And the standing committee today decides which project to be allowed and which to be disallowed. It never disallows a project, but which has to be allowed and what are the conditions that are there. And you have a policy of certain people who once get in, never leave it, right? And they continue to be part of it. We know all of them, the names are very much there. And this model, where I've also written many, and there are many others who have written on it, saying that the standing committee of the National Board for Wildlife is an illegal body today, because it has not been constituted by the National Board itself. It is constituted by the minister. What they now propose to do is to replicate this illegal model in the state itself by saying that the vice chairperson will now select. It says now, which is section 6 says, the board may constitute a standing committee for the purpose of exercising such powers and such duties as may be delegated to it. The standing committee shall consist of vice chairperson and not more than 10 members to be nominated by the vice chairperson amongst the members of the board. It is like that concept of maximum punishment. When they say not more than 10 members can mean just one member. So vice chairperson along with one member, and there is no requirement that the one member should be the NGO member. They can take it like currently what happens is National Board has one NGO member, and that one NGO member is from an organization called the Gir Foundation. Gir Foundation is headed by the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and the member secretary or the director is a serving IFS officer, and it goes in the name of an NGO, and it rubber stamps on every proposal that comes. So therefore, the forest minister of the state will now select one who can be an institutional member, can be an official member, and decide on projects that are there. At the same time, I want to just make one thing very clear, that there's been a lot of discussions on powers, like if you see on Hubli Ankola and others saying, well, reject Hubli Ankola, state board is told. My point is a little different. My point is the State Board for Wildlife has no power at all to either reject or to approve any project. The State Board for Wildlife approved the Ken-Betwa link in Madhya Pradesh. The State Board has no power to approve. It has no power to reject. It has no power to even consider such projects. So therefore, this is something that we must be very clear, because the duties of the State Board is mentioned in the law itself. It says that it shall be the duty of the State Board to look into selection and management of areas to be declared as protected areas, formulation of policy, matters relating to amendment in schedule, harmonizing the needs of forest dwellers of the forest and protection of conservation, any other matters connected with the protection of wildlife. Destruction of wildlife is not within the mandate of the State Board for Wildlife. Unfortunately, 99% of the work of the State Board for Wildlife today is only in granting approval for projects on which the State Board has no power, no statutory power at all. And by constituting a standing committee, the government is giving legitimacy to an illegal act of the State Boards for Wildlife in considering projects for grant or rejection of approval. So what I would now go for is the next section, which is there, is with regard to section 29 of the Wildlife Protection Act. Now, I always say section 29 and section 36, subclause 35, subclause 6 is the heart and soul of the Wildlife Protection Act. When we call an area as a national park and a sanctuary, why is it so important? Why is it that this area gets extra protection? In order to understand that, the most important provision is section 29. And what section 29 essentially says is, no activity is permitted in a sanctuary or a national park unless it is for the benefit of wildlife. That's it. It has to be of direct benefit to wildlife. No person shall remove, exploit, or remove any wildlife, forest produce, destroy, damage habitat of any wild animal, or divert, stop, or enhance the flow of water inside and outside a sanctuary, except in accordance with a permit granted by the Chief Wildlife Warden, and no such permit shall be granted unless the Chief Wildlife Warden, in consultation with the board, the state board, is satisfied that such removal of wildlife or from a sanctuary or change in the flow of water is necessary for the improvement and better management of wildlife. So the primary condition that is there is that it should be for the better management. Therefore, Ken Betwa project, which involves diversion of nearly 100 square kilometers inside the core critical tiger habitat, inside the national park, is not a permissible activity under section 29 and the similar provision, which is section 35 subclause 6 of the Wildlife Protection Act. Now, on the face of it, this is where I would like to emphasize. It says you cannot divert it. So if the Son Gharial sanctuary is there, you want to change it. Yes, you can change it, provided it is in the interest of the Gharial. If you remove certain produce, because it is for the benefit of wildlife, the law says, well, you can only use it for the bona fide needs of people living inside, in and around the sanctuary. And this was because the forest department at one time said there's a sal borer epidemic in Kana. They decided to cut the trees, sell it to the Forest Development Corporation and earn money. The court said, well, you cannot do that. Even if you cut sal and teak trees, on the ground, it is essential for better management of wildlife. It can only be used for bona fide need of people living in and around and not for any commercial one. So this is where it is change in the flow. Now, if you look at it here, the new law on the face of it looks good. Let me tell you. It says that today, for the purpose of this section, bona fide use of drinking and household water by local communities shall not be deemed to be an act prohibited under this section. Now, if somebody looks at it, what's the problem? You know, if it is bona fide use of drinking and household water by local communities, it is an act which is not prohibited under the section. I don't think so anybody should have a problem with this. But there are serious problems. If you look at 29 here, it uses the word, the existing law says, well, if you remove forest produce, it will be used for personal bona fide needs of people living in and around the sanctuary. What the new law says, water can be used by local communities for drinking and household purposes by local community. Now, where is the definition of local? How far is local? How far is national? How far is state? They have not defined local community. So my fear is this provision will be used to approve projects like Ken Betwa and many other diversion, because if you look at it here today, sanctuaries like Chambal, the single biggest threat that the sanctuary faces in addition to sand mining is massive extraction of water, which compromises on the survival of the gharial, a critically endangered species with a population of less than 400. Now there, it is now going to the towns, where it is quota, where it's others. Huge extraction machines have been put in to supply water. Now, they said, okay, everyone in India is local. That's what in the Biodiversity Act they are saying. So if they use this local part, you will today have water being extracted at times when water is already at low levels. So nothing, it is giving a license. So my submission would be that this is extremely problematic. It needs to be clarified. Use it for people living in and around sanctuaries. What is around needs to be specified. When and how it is to be used to be always specified again. Water crisis, water is the biggest limiting factor for wildlife today. So if you have those water holes, what will happen if during the very same time water is extracted when wild animals also need it. So I would say this is something that needs to be checked. But most importantly, in the existing form it goes, it will be a can of worms, and it will actually open up all our rivers inside national parks and sanctuaries for projects of drinking water nature. And it's very easy. We have seen it in EI notification. Big projects, yet and whole to others, merely by calling it as a drinking water project. Nobody is willing to challenge. They are outside the purview of EIA. The courts will not come in because it's for drinking water. So by merely stating that the project is drinking water for local community, we may actually jeopardize the life of many rivers in the country. Let's forget wildlife for a moment also. So if you look at it here, in every meeting that you find, 1 hectare of forest is gone, but then water extraction structures are put in, which is again very, very problematic. Now it's also here that in 33, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of it is the fact that there's a requirement to have management plan. The existing law says Chief Wildlife Warden shall be the authority who shall manage and maintain all sanctuaries and construct ABCD. This is the existing law. The new law says manage and maintain sanctuaries in accordance with such management plans for a sanctuary which is prepared by him as per guidelines issued by the central government, and in case the area falls under scheduled area or areas where the Scheduled Tribe and Traditional Forest Dwellers Act is applicable, in accordance with management plan for such sanctuary prepared in consultation with the Gram Sabha. Now, it is important here that they have recognized that in both scheduled areas, which would mean Schedule 5 and Schedule 6 areas, and in addition to that, in all the areas where FRA applies, it should be prepared in consultation with the Gram Sabha that is there. So there is one aspect there, but very importantly, what I would also say here is that I think it still confers huge amount of power on the Chief Wildlife Warden, because the Chief Wildlife Warden still becomes the authority to decide. I would say this management plan needs to be approved, if at all, by other departments, including the MOEF, NTCA if the area is there, and taking inputs from tribal departments and others so far as implementation of this plan is concerned. This is going to be important, because we cannot give all the discretion on the Chief Wildlife Warden. Chief Wildlife Warden is a post. Let's look at it. It does not reflect expertise on a subject. It is a post that has no fixed tenure. It is a post which does not require any qualification. So therefore, to assume that the Chief Wildlife Warden will be the person who will have interest in wildlife only and nothing else is a fairly wrong assumption or presumption that we are having. And I think this law has a major problem, because it confers too much of authority and power on the Chief Wildlife Warden and trust that is equally problematic. Now, coming to my few of my last part, which is there is live elephants. And I think this is very, very important again because of one aspect. And before that, let me just go back a little bit about what the law today says. Now, the Wildlife Protection Act is very clear, which says that no person other than a person having a certificate of ownership shall, after acquire, receive, keep in his control, custody, or possession any captive animal, animal article, trophy, except by way of inheritance. So what it says, existing law is, nobody can acquire, receive, keep in his control, custody, and possession. In law, these three are very important. I may not be the owner of an elephant, but I'm keeping it in my custody. So the Mahavat is the custodian, but not really the person who has the ownership over it. So this says that if it is an animal, article, so whether it's ivory, whether it's tiger skin, you have to get it registered. But if you want to have it, the only way that you can own it, have custody or possession, is only through one mode, that is in inheritance. And every person inheriting such an animal shall within 90 days of this inheritance make an application to the Chief Wildlife Warden. But importantly, this law, that is the existing law, also says inheritance shall not apply to live elephants. And the reason is very simple. See, the there is no guarantee that the son or the daughter is in a position to keep the elephant. So because it's a live elephant, with ivory and all, you can pass it off, give it to them, they can surrender it to the government with the provision is there, or keep it in the locker. But to keep a live elephant means that you have to feed it. You have to keep a mahavat. It needs expenditure, you need space. So the law rightly says, well, don't insist on inheritance for elephants. Next part it says is that in section 43 says that no person having in his possession any captive animal on which he has a certificate of ownership shall offer by way of offer for sale or any other mode of commercial nature, any animal article trophy. So existing law says that transfer, that is by way of sale or otherwise, is not permissible by any other mode of consideration, any other mode, by sale by any other mode, when a person transfers to which he recites such and such things. Now it says that nothing in this one tail feather or article, it says any other mode of consideration of commercial of article 1. If you look very clearly, it says regulation is there. Any other mode of consideration of commercial nature simply means commercial trade is not permissible under section 43. It's a complete bar. So commercial trade of species which are listed in the act is not permissible. Not only sale is not permitted, even the offer for sale is an illegal act. This is what the law is. And if you look at it here, there's an exception that is given saying that tail feather of peacock. Very recently, there was a lot of controversy because, there was a tail feather been seen of a prominent person, many of us know. And they were saying, oh my God, he's done a legal one. But this 43 says tail feather of a peacock is not included in the Wildlife Protection Act. We may like it or not, but it is not in the act itself. Now, the new law now says in section 43, it says the section shall not apply to the transfer or transport of a live elephant by a person having a certificate of ownership where such person has obtained the permission of the state government on fulfillment of certain conditions. So what it says in 4 is section 43 will not apply to live elephants. So if I go back to 43, it clearly says no person having in his possession animal article trophy or uncured trophy in which he has a certificate of ownership can offer by way of sale or offer for sale or any other mode of commercial consideration. So the only way in which elephants are going from one person to the other, inheritance is not applicable, but it can be through mode of gift. Trade is not permissible. Commercial trade is not permissible under the existing law. And at a time where we all know that captive elephant is a practice, keeping animals in captivity and especially elephant is a practice that needs to be done away with. It needs to be eliminated completely, like what has been happening with sloth bear and like many other social customs. It is a practice that needs to be done away with. Unfortunately, now if you look at it here, it says the section shall not apply to the transport. So enter to any live elephant where the person has a certificate of ownership. Ownership certificate can be taken. And if you look at it here, the problem is today that roughly out of 25,000 elephants that we have in the wild, nearly 10% of the wild population in terms of absolute numbers, we have 2,454 captive elephants in the country. And what this law unfortunately does is the amendment is actually to perpetuate the worst kind of cruelty, because most of the elephants that we have today are being caught from the wild and trained, because nobody wants to keep an elephant for 18 years, 17 years, and then to train them. So it is not something that is bred in captivity. Wild animals are caught, documents are fudged, and they land up in the most useless of work. A lot of them are used in begging. Many of them are in temples. And if you see today, this is the condition that is there. Assam has 905. And if you look at it here, one of the very important things is the forest department has very few elephants. bulk of them are in private hands. And therefore, today what will happen as a result of it is the trade and ownership of elephant, which should have no place in a civilized society. Today, this amendment in the Wildlife Protection Act will actually encourage that, including capture of elephants from the wild, because these documents are changed. So I'll not get into the details of it, but this is an issue of very serious concern. So I end by stating that there should be, at least these are my personal opinion, standing committee of State Board for Wildlife should not be allowed to be set up. State Board for Wildlife, on the other hand, should also be, we must remind the committee also, standing committee, that State Board for Wildlife should strictly do activities which is mandated under the law. Approval of projects which involves destruction of wildlife habitat is not a permissible activity for SBWL, or for the matter NBWL also, if it is within a national park and sanctuary. Water use in the sanctuary needs clarity. There are genuine issues. I'm not at all undermining the right of people. At the same time, I think this open-ended use of terms like household purposes and local communities will be provisions which will be massively misused to finish off many of the rivers and streams that are running through our national park and sanctuary. The management plans needs a more participatory and scientific exercise involving many departments and cannot be left to the Chief Wildlife Warden's discretion. We have to change this definition of alien exotic species to problematic species which are invasive, irrespective of whether it is local or foreign. I think this whole idea of regarding everything foreign as only bad and everything Indian being good is a disease that is suffered by both the Biodiversity Act and the Wildlife Protection Act. I think that is something that needs. And I would say that this law should have moved in the direction of phasing out captive elephants, because that is where this law, if it is progressive, and repeatedly the Supreme Court and many others have said that the direction should be an ecocentric approach, species best interest standard, and an approach that is ecocentric in nature, and which keeps the ultimate good is the doctrine of public trust, because that's what the Supreme Court said in the Lion case, that in terms of the doctrine of public trust, we must give right to life not only to human beings, but it must also extend to animals, and especially in animals which are in danger of extinction and other threats that they face. So I would end here by stating that there are serious issues that needs to be taken up. There are certain positive elements, but we cannot undermine the problematic part of this particular bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritvik. Excellent presentation and very clear in terms of, in simple words, explaining what are the serious concerns related to the Act, and I think makes a lot of difference. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the participants. I also wanted to ask you, because you right in the beginning did mention that the standing committee does have a limited role. But I think in addition to all these really serious concerns that you have raised, what the proposed amendments are bringing about, there are also concerns which are related to what the amendment is not talking about. So considering that since 2006, 2006 was the last comprehensive amendment carried out, which was also the year when certain legal changes were happening, like the Forest Rights Bill Act was brought up. But many of the provisions which needed to be reconciled between the two laws were not done at that point in time. Since then, we have seen that the laws like the Forest Rights Act, Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act have been implemented on the ground. There have been flaws with their implementation. They have been slow in their implementation, but 15 and more years of their implementation has already brought about a certain kind of ground reality. So we see that there are changes in the law, there are changes in the ground reality, and this act just does not take into account, considering that it is coming 15, 16 years after the first amendment, does not take into account those ground realities or the fact that these laws exist. A very simple example you mentioned about the management plans. I think that's a very good provision that has been brought up. But the fact is that there are provisions in the Forest Rights Act which talk about community forest resource rights to be claimed, and the committees which have been created for the management of these CFRs should be preparing management plans. So this act actually should be taking into account how these two get complement each other, how these two are brought into reconciliation of some sort, which it doesn't. But more seriously, if we look at the provisions related to the settlement of rights, which is exactly more or less the same as what it was in the previous act, the very fact that there has been such elaborate exploration of recognition of rights process in the Forest Rights Act is completely ignored. So the two questions that I wanted to bring up in this regard, one was, what are the implications of such omission? Legal implications of such omissions, considering that these amendments are coming after these acts are already being implemented. The second question that I wanted to ask you, that even if there are limitations about bringing these to the standing committee, what should be the right sort of approach right now to try and bring them in the amendments that are coming up? If not through the standing committee, then through what channels? Yeah. So.
Yeah, thanks, Nima. I think these are very, very important questions. These are issues of concern, because if you look at it, in terms of what has been proposed in the bill, it doesn't really address, maybe both from conservation, livelihood perspective, almost 70 to 80% of the concerns. There are serious issues. Now, even if you look from the wildlife perspective, it doesn't really consider some of the most important aspect. Say, how do you protect wild animals or birds or species outside national parks and sanctuaries? It still follows essentially that everything in national park and sanctuaries will be protected, everything outside can be destroyed. There's a problem there. So if you look at it here, I'm not really aware, but it seems to be a job that was done, or it was something that was pending in piecemeal at different points of time, which they tried to fix in by bringing about this law. So therefore, I don't think so. The issues that are there, if you ask me, I have about at least 5 to 10 points on every provisions of the law as to why it is problematic. The penalty provision is problematic. The provision with regard to the process of declaration is very, very problematic. The fact that it doesn't distinguish the different modes in which forest is to be managed. What is in 5th schedule area is different from 6th schedule area. What is there? It doesn't recognize all of it. So to that extent, my point would be that the standing committee may not be the right place, because if you look at it here, the standing committee is only to look at the clauses. Well, they may write a big report, but it doesn't really have that value. At the same time, I think nothing stops us from demanding that, having brought in the changes, this is now time for systematic reform in the way the Wildlife Protection Act is framed, keeping in view the fact that, what we have today is a 1972 vintage. And what has happened post 1972 is so many different changes, whether it's from the environmental perspective to the rights perspective. There has been so many changes, and none of those issues of larger concern is today within the domain of the Wildlife Protection Act itself. So we have serious issues, and I would say that post this law being passed or whatever, nothing stops people from demanding that a comprehensive review be done of the act itself, which takes into account the current realities. My only fear, that I'll be very honest about, is that of late any law that gets reformed is only gets reformed in the direction which allows for greater exploitation of the resources. So sometimes having the law in that form is sometimes better than trying to reform, because if the mind is ease of doing business, then the last thing that one should be doing is actually to reform and change in these laws. But at the same time, let me answer it. One should strive for a comprehensive review or certain provisions which you are saying in the law itself. But that can be a later process, or it can be a simultaneous process, but not necessarily during this time.
Thank you, Ritvik. I pass it on to my colleague Akshay, who will be taking up questions from the audience. Akshay, over to
Thank you. Thank you, Ritvik, and thank you, Nima, for the presentation and also for bringing up the majority of the issues which have been missed by this amendment. We have a couple of questions. I think I can start with the critical wildlife habitat process. And so the question is, what can be done to reconcile the provisions of critical wildlife habitat under FRA along with the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act?
Sorry, I didn't get, I just missed the last part. Can you just?
So the question was, what can be done to reconcile the provisions of critical wildlife habitat under the Forest Rights Act with provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act?
See, my answer to this is that the existing law does not deal with this. So therefore, I'm actually not going to comment because of the reason that we'll be digressing. There are a lot of processes that can be possible in order to ensure that critical wildlife habitat meets the requirement of FRA. But if you look at this law itself, the amendment bill that is there, it doesn't touch this issue at all. So I would say that, whatever suggestion I can always be in touch, but to give how to reconcile it is a different submission that one has to make. It need not be with respect to this particular bill that has been circulated.
Thank you, Ritik. The second question is, I think, regarding the definition of the invasive alien species. So the question is, will Project Cheetah be part of the invasive alien species?
No, because of two reasons. Number one, the project will flop. The cheetahs will unlikely to breed. It will never be invasive, right? To maintain that 5 level cheetah itself will be a tough thing. They will live in a safari, park-like condition, using the budget of 40 crores, which have been told, which is the combined budget of NTCA, NBW, Wildlife Institute of India, National Biodiversity Authority, all combined together do not get 40 crores. But then this fancy safari park will come in. Most of these animals will have to be physically fed by humans. There is no question of them becoming invasive. They are not alien because, strangely enough, though the Supreme Court has said it, there are certain people, definitely credible one, but I still have problems with it, where they say, well, African cheetah and Indian cheetah are the same. Genetically, they are all the same. Therefore, it doesn't matter. So they are Indian species. But to the question that is there, even if they're Indian, it is unlikely that they become invasive.
Thank you, Ritik. In addition to that, it would also be good to get clarity on whether the management process will be done under the NTCA, but since the area itself is a national park, but the project is being done under the National Tiger Conservation Authority. So how would the management process work out?
See, I'm also a little bit not clear, because if you look at here, they have not mentioned about management plan for national parks. They are saying management plan is with regard to sanctuary. Now, normally they would have said that the provisions of section 33, that particular clause should apply also with regard to national parks. So really speaking, this is again an area which would need clarity, because what happens if the area is not a sanctuary and there is a requirement to prepare a management plan? Now, in that case, will it go before that Gram Sabha or not, is again an issue that needs clarity on this. But to your question, what will happen if a portion of it, now there is a problem that comes in. You see, you have a tiger reserve. The tiger reserve has a sanctuary, a portion of it is a national park, a portion of it is a reserve forest. Now, if you look here, they will say, well, out of the 1000 square kilometer, 50 square kilometer is a sanctuary. Now we will come out with a management plan for the 50 square kilometer, which will require the Gram Sabha consent, Gram Sabha consultation and all others. But with regard to the rest of it, we will do as per our wish. Again, I think this has not been well thought of. And, I was just seeing it because linked to this is, the question which Ashish has asked here is the fact with regard to consultation. Yes, it is a problem because they've used the word said in consultation and not consent, right? So there is always an issue. And if you look at most of the laws that have been there, they've somehow not been very open about the use of the word consent. Though in the Wildlife Protection Act, when it comes to declaration of areas as critical tiger and others, they're using the word consent of the Gram Sabha to the relocation package while declaring it. So I think the word consent can be used and should be used. Otherwise, the other point will be to interpret consultation as consent itself. And that has happened. It's very strange that in environmental law, they don't agree with it. But if you look at it, they always say the precedent in consultation with the Council of Ministers. There, the word consultation has been understood as consent. But we still don't equate both together. So in one area, consultation has been interpreted as consent. But I agree that, where the word consultation means, it is better to use the word consent.
Thank you, Ritvik. The next question is regarding, I think, human-wildlife mitigation, conflict mitigation. So the question is there any provision regarding wildlife-friendly railway tracking construction?
Sorry, I did.
Is there any provision regarding wildlife-friendly railway tracking construction?
See, with regard to that, again, not related to this bill, we have now the guidelines for linear projects, right, which has been issued by Wildlife Institute of India and also NBWL. And that technically should be applied in all the instances. Unfortunately, again, it does not get implemented.
The next question is, ecotourism has been classified as a forestry activity, opening doors for ecotourism camps in and around sanctuaries. What would be your opinion on this?
This is not in this law. It is in the guidelines that have been issued under the Forest Conservation Act. It's a completely illegal act. Let me tell you very clearly, because ecotourism can very well be practiced in revenue lands around national parks and sanctuaries. You have all the resorts and every other activity can happen, in the revenue land which is there. We've already seen what kind of damage that has happened by even giving revenue land. We have not properly defined what is ecotourism. We have not clearly defined, what are the kind of regulations, what is the certification system for defining an ecotourism. Therefore, to allow forest land to be used for ecotourism activity completely violates the provisions of the Forest Conservation Act and National Forest Policy. I've always stated that, the government's policy all throughout has been that forest land should not be diverted for two purposes. One is agriculture and secondly is housing. Right? These are the two areas on which no forest land is diverted. Now they're changing that. Ecotourism is a housing for people who are permanently going to be there on rotational basis. So how can you allow ecotourism activities in forest land when any other use with regard to housing and agriculture is not permissible? So we are in the process of challenging the notification or the guidelines that has been issued by the government. And I would say that anyone who is interested can give us inputs on this. But this is completely contrary to both policy and the Forest Conservation Act.
Thank you, Ritik. The next question is, could you talk a little bit about the possible implications of inclusion of circuses, rescue centers, and conservation breeding centers in the definition of zoos in the amendment? See,
the thing that is there is that so far as zoos are concerned, one of the benefit that comes in is that they come within the jurisdiction of the Central Zoo Authority. So if the definition of zoo is expanded to include many of them, it would have, according to me, this is my own understanding, a positive, because many of them would escape or were away from the control of the Central Zoo Authority. So by expanding the definition of zoo to include all of them, then certain kind of regulation and restrictions can come in. There's still a problem, it has reduced, but there's a problem of traveling zoos, circuses and others, and the way that they're keeping animals. So I would say that an expanded definition is helpful in order to protect the animals that are in circuses, and many of the time, because even if you look at rescue centers, some of the rescue centers are nothing but a concentration camp for animals. So therefore, it is necessary to have certain standards in place. Unfortunately, the Central Zoo Authority itself is an authority which needs far better regulation and far more support, because merely by saying that it will be under CZA will not work also. I think CZA also needs to ensure that the zoos are properly kept and meets the purpose of conservation rather than entertainment.
Thank you, Ritik. I think we have a bunch of questions on the offences cognizable under the Wildlife Act. So the questions are: what is the procedure to be followed when offences are detected? Whether to register FIR or to file complaint before the court? Who have to investigate the offences?
See, I'm be sorry for this, but this will need another training on or orientation on the Wildlife Protection Act. I'm happy to do it whenever possible, but because I'll be we'll be moving out of the subject itself, digressing. So I would just say that sorry, I won't be able to answer it, not because I'm not keen to answer it, but I think we'll be digressing from the topic itself.
Thank you, Ritvik. The next question is: how will the amendment affect communities living in the fringes of national parks or the indigenous communities living near forest areas?
See, it's very difficult to understand it, but as I said that, we will, if, for example, the level of protection is reduced, which is there can be an impact. As I said today, that, if they, for example, misuse the provision, which is likely to happen because somewhere down the line, it is not a simple amendment. If they start diverting, all the water from the national parks and sanctuaries and give it to the nearest cities, towns or other habitation or household purposes, you can have a situation where the local people or the community that is living inside sanctuaries or in proximity are denied access because that resource is going to somewhere else. So there can be a serious problem. It's difficult to know where all, what are the other kind of problem, but definitely I see this as a problem. Though on the plain reading of it, first impression is, well, it's a very good, innocuous, harmless, in fact, a positive provision. But if the interpretation is what, if they interpret it in the way that I think they are likely to, it can deny access of resources. It can cause displacement. Ultimately, if you look at Ken Betwa, what is happening today? That 100 square kilometer area where the project will come up inside Panna Tiger Reserve, right? The only thing that is coming in the way is that the Wildlife Protection Act does not allow them to use the water for an activity which is not for the benefit of wildlife. Now, if they take that out and say, well, it is for household purpose of local community, that would exactly mean that the people around them are going to suffer. In that 100 square kilometer, if you just know the history of it, this was the area where there were 14 or 13 villages. They were relocated and taken out of the park because they wanted tigers to be introduced from Kanha, because tigers had got locally extinct. They declared it as a core critical tiger habitat. And after that, they found that you need a power plant, the river linking project here. So now the tiger are to be displaced. Now, therefore, as a compensation, they said, well, to compensate, we will now declare areas adjacent to it. And which are the adjacent area where the 13 villages had gone and settled. Those 13 villages will now be again thrown out. So therefore, using the harmless word of drinking water or irrigation water, I see a process of opening up large parts of India, because as many of you would know that these national parks and sanctuaries are the source of origin of many rivers and water sources. And that's where, everybody wants it. And by everybody, I mean those who are keen to exploit these resources.
Thank you, Ritvik. The next question is regarding wildlife research. So the question is, what are some of the improvements with regard to wildlife research that the amendment bill could make and research groups could push for?
I'll be honest, I have not very carefully looked at it, but I'll be in my submissions that are there, because I need to understand from the researchers whether they see it as positive or not. Because I have never been a researcher and I have not seen the forest from the perspective of research itself. So I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer this. Maybe somebody who's a researcher can be better placed to actually look at compare between what was earlier and what is present. But yes, there has been a lot of problem with researchers, I know, it's always easier to get a mining permit for a national park and sanctuary than to get a research permit. So this has been the problem, and I've seen Forest Department creating more problems for a photographer than for someone who wants to do exploratory drilling. So I think we need to have more easier research activity, and I think somebody else can answer it, but I'll be happy to look into it based on whatever experience I have and give suggestions.
Thank you, Ritik. The next question is, would arguing for personhood status for wildlife and rivers might be useful in strengthening this law?
See, again, this is another debate that we need to get into, because in the present form, I think they are not even looking at such ideas of personhood. They're not even considering it as element. They're not even considering it as a natural entity that needs to be protected. So if you look at the idea behind constituting a standing committee, the whole idea is how do we ensure faster destruction of national parks and sanctuaries. That's the problem I see it. So idea to constitute a standing committee is not to protect these areas, but actually to destroy the areas. So we are far away when it comes to personhood, but that does not stop anybody from raising these issues, on a continuous basis, because changes can happen.
And the next question is, what in your opinion would be the impact of increased penalties as per the amendment?
Yes. Now you see, I'm not very great supporter. Penalty is a great way to say, well, the government is serious about a particular crime, but actually it sometimes achieves the opposite purpose. Now, let me give you an example. You see, with regard to tiger reserves, you see, they very clearly say, even the existing law, that any offense in a tiger reserve shall be punishable with a term of imprisonment which shall not be less than 3 years, and with a fine which I think is not less than 50,000 rupees or so. Now you tell me, suppose in a very simple form, grazing is an offense. Now, will you send somebody to 3 years of imprisonment because the person is grazing the cattle in a national park and sanctuary? No, not a single person in India. We know national park and sanctuary grazing is happening. Firewood has been taken out. These are all offenses in a tiger reserve. And let me tell you, not a single person ever will be convicted by any court of law in India stating that you go to jail for 3 years because you have violated the provision of law, and therefore I have no discretion as a magistrate to give you a lesser punishment than 3 years. But what it does is that it creates a sense of fear and allows the corrupt element to take in money from those who violate the law because of many reasons. And therefore, that fear that, you'll go to jail for 3 years, therefore now you give me a part of the wood that you have collected or chicken from your home or cash. This is what it allows everything to be done. So there is nothing to show that by increasing penalty, you will actually reduce the crime. In fact, it can be the other way around. You see, I have seen it in many parts there where, see, the offender is, say, let me take you example, the range of offenders, not just a forest dweller. We can always look at. There are people, for example, who go on holidays or evenings with a car, go out and kill a jungle fowl. Now, under the law, since you have killed a jungle fowl, you should be sent to a jail for 3 years. Now, in reality, even if the forest department goes and files a case in the magistrate's court, the magistrate will say, "एक मुर्गा को मारा है, उसके लिए आप 3 साल के जेल मांगते हैं, right? 3 साल बाद केस लगाइए." As a result, that fellow who has been caught will continue with it. On the other hand, if you say that if somebody is caught for then in such a situation, it shall be punishable with a spot fine of such an amount. And if you put a fine, say, of 2,000 or 3,000, that fellow will not come back because 3,000 rupees for a chicken is quite expensive. So we must look at innovative ways in dealing with offenses. And it's very interesting that when it comes to Biodiversity Act or environment offenses, they come with minor offense, major offense, serious offense. Here, all offenses have been clubbed as one. So really, this increase in offenses doesn't really serve a purpose. And look at the tragedy today. They have decriminalized all offenses under the Biodiversity Act. And here, every provision, the fine amount has been increased. That will not be a deterrent so far as offenses are concerned. In fact, it is very clear, the more the level of punishment, the higher the chance of the person going scot-free. That's why, if you say that I will give death penalty on an offense, there is a serious problem, because the person will sell his land, house, everything to protect himself and come out scot-free. On the other hand, if you say that, okay, you will go for 1 month in prison, or you pay a fine, or you do some other activity, it's a better chance to actually make changes. So I personally do not think penalty provision and increasing it will make any difference so far as the crime is concerned. In fact, the other way around, it should have been more creative in reducing penalties where it's required, so that it's, it becomes a deterrent.
Thank you, Ritik. I think we can take 2 more questions before we close this session, since we're running out of time. One question is, will there be a chance to reconcile animal rights and wildlife conservation under the proposed amendments?
See, it's an opportunity. As I said, when you look at animal rights, there are certain provisions there. Now, for example, when around 2002 or 2003, elephants died because of a capture operation in Sarguja, the provisions was included in the act under section 9 and 11, saying that in the process of capture of an animal should be done so as to cause minimum cruelty and harm to the animal. It's very, very important to put in provisions with regard to animal rights. We must look at that in a very holistic manner. Let me be a little bit more controversial. For example, does it really make sense to capture wild elephants, which are problematic, which they say is problematic, and then train them? I would rather advocate, let me be very open about it, it is much better to kill an elephant rather than to train an elephant. So if you look at the animal rights point of view, the act says your first effort should be to capture an elephant. The second will be to keep it in captivity. And if it cannot be, keep it in captivity, if it cannot be released back into the wild. As a result, we are today disturbing family groups of elephants across, putting them through the most horrendous training programs, which we call them, make them perform work which they, as a natural, as an animal, they're not supposed to do. So really speaking, we must look at it from the animal rights point of view. And as I said, this provision with regard to permitting trade and commercial trade goes completely contrary to the principles which recognize animal rights. So therefore, these provisions need to be challenged, because certain practices need to be done away with. Keeping elephants in captivity, training and capturing wild elephants, sending them to camps. I know in Karnataka and all, anyone who sees the video can never ever justify capturing this animal. They are much better dead than to be trained in this form. So my point is that there was a great opportunity, which is of including animal rights principles into the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act. Unfortunately, it has not happened.
Thank you, Ritvik. The last question is, could the amendment include the legality of rights of way and green infrastructure into the act itself, instead of having separate guidelines?
Sorry, I didn't get your point. Green infrastructure.
Green infrastructure. To have the green infrastructure.
Should have been. I definitely say it should be made mandatory. That you cannot. And in fact, my point is today that almost all activities that are happening in national park and sanctuaries, if you look at it in terms of section 29, you cannot do any infrastructure which is not for the benefit of wildlife. That's it. That is why we have that 2%, 3% area as national park and sanctuary, because these are the only areas where you technically should not allow any activity which is not for the betterment of wildlife. And if at all green infrastructure is there, you avoid national park and sanctuary and areas outside it. See, we must not forget that the problem with this Wildlife Protection Act that exists today is that it assumes that all wild animals exist only in national park and sanctuary. Now, that is a very wrong idea. They forget that, you know, the squirrel that you see in your next to your home, the lizard that is standing there, the birds that are on top of your terrace are all wild animals as per the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act. And if you look at that, bulk of wild animals today exists outside national parks and sanctuaries. And this law looks at wildlife essentially from the perspective of them being only in these national park and sanctuaries. So to answer your question, I would say green infrastructure for all and no destructive activities within national parks and sanctuaries. The only exception that can be there is if it's essential activities which are allowed under the Forest Rights Act.
Thank you once again, Ritvik, for the presentation and also for the answering these questions. I'll pass it over to Nima to close the session.
Thank you, Ritvik. I'm sure all the answers and the presentation will really help all of us sort of refine our submissions and also draft those who have not been able to draft so far. I just also wanted to, on your behalf, say that your presentation will be on your website, and we have also shared the link. Sure. So if anyone wanted to refer to them, they would be available for future comments. I hope more and more submissions are made before the 11th. Also, I do hope after this discussion, and perhaps we can also take this discussion forward to think about the larger perspective that you were talking about, the larger issues which are not covered in this act, how we can take that process forward. We will be probably having this discussion in times to come. Thank you very much to you and to the LIFE team. Thank you, everyone. We apologize that we were not able to unmute everyone because we've had some experiences in the past which were not very pleasant. So when there are a large number of participants, we have sort of disabled the unmute function, so everybody had to type in their questions. So we apologize for those who couldn't ask their questions personally. Many thanks to my colleagues, Shruti, Akshay, Meenal, and Tanya for all the background work. And thank you all for your presence. We hope to meet sometime soon. On a positive note, maybe Ritvik explaining the provisions of the Act, as you said, the training program on Wildlife Protection Act sometime.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you, everyone.